Not only did we crack into the fraud that these perpetrators committed on the grand stage of the NBA, but we also
What happens when a foreign-backed cartel executes a man on US soil with military precision and does it in a quiet American neighborhood at 10:48 p.m.? The scene in El Paso felt less like a criminal hit and more like the opening blast of a conflict crossing into the United States. A convenience store parking lot, a sudden burst of controlled gunfire, 3 men down, 2 off-duty officers killed, 1 high-value target eliminated with chilling accuracy. It was not chaos, it was choreography, and it forced the country to confront a question no one expected to face this decade. How deep inside America had this threat already reached? The attack shattered the assumption that cartel violence stayed on the other side of the border. According to early briefings reviewed by Reuters and BBC investigators, the precision of the strike suggested trained shooters disciplined escape routes and pre-attack surveillance methods resembling insurgent tactics, not street-level crime. The victim, Nico Delta Cruz, had long operated smuggling corridors stretching across New Mexico and Texas, even overseeing an electrified ventilated underground tunnel. Once exposed, he became a liability to his own organization, and cartels erase liabilities, especially ones who know too much. Key developments unfolded rapidly. Agents combing the El Paso scene found no sloppy mistakes, no dropped weapons, no traces of panic. Instead, the markers pointed to an organization that had learned to operate quietly inside the United States, an organization authorities soon linked to a name whispered with fear, La Empresa. This group did not behave like traditional cartels. It did not leave bodies scattered as warnings. It eliminated problems with clean, controlled bursts disappearing before police sirens reached the block. Over the past 18 months, investigators connected La Empresa to 27 targeted killings, each carried out with similar discipline. Defense analysts cited by DW and Janes noted that the group's operational style resembled small unit warfare more than criminal improvisation. Strategically, the El Paso hit revealed something more dangerous than a single execution. It exposed a structure, a network forming inside US territory, operating through suburban safe houses, migrant holding sites, and modified vehicles built for evasion. The attack showed coordination, funding, intelligence sharing, and confidence. And confidence is what alarms national security officials most. A cartel that believes it can kill 2 US officers in a public parking lot, then vanish without hesitation, is a cartel that feels no fear of consequences. That imbalance between state authority and a growing paramilitary criminal network raised alarms in Washington, where the administration ordered immediate intelligence consolidation across DHS, FBI, and ICE. But beyond strategy and geopolitics, the human impact was immediate and devastating. Families in El Paso awoke to the news that officers who had simply gone to pick up a friend were gunned down with no chance to react. Witnesses described not chaos, but silence, the eerie quiet that follows precision. Migrants held in hidden rooms across Sunland Park and Las Cruces, later discovered by agents, had no idea the man whose murder they heard on the news had once been the conduit moving them across the border. They were pieces of a system that viewed human beings not as people, but as leverage. As the story spread, communities across the Southwest asked the question officials feared most. If a cartel can strike like this once, what stops them from doing it again? And how far inside American neighborhoods has this shadow war already advanced? How does a criminal organization become so quiet, so disciplined, so deeply embedded that entire American suburbs never realize it has already moved in? That question took center stage as investigators expanded their search beyond the El Paso execution site. What initially appeared to be a single retaliatory hit soon revealed itself as only the surface of a far more organized penetration. Federal intelligence teams reviewing hours of surveillance, financial trails, and intercepted communications began seeing a pattern, not scattershot cartel violence, but the infrastructure of a shadow network operating with the precision of a clandestine military unit. The name rising to the top of every briefing was the same one whispered by smugglers and terrified migrants, La Empresa. According to analysts referenced by BBC and Al Jazeera, this group had built a reputation in Mexico for avoiding chaotic street battles, opting instead for clean, controlled operations designed to leave no trace. Now those same tactics were appearing across New Mexico and Texas. The group moved migrants, drugs, and money through corridors that crossed state lines, quietly leaving minimal digital footprints and almost no witnesses. It was a cartel behaving like an intelligence service patient, calculated and focused. Key developments intensified the alarm. Agents discovered that Cruz, the El Paso target, had not been merely a smuggler. He was the connective tissue between Mexican cartel leaders and a clandestine US-based infrastructure. Hidden in ordinary neighborhoods were stash sites that did not resemble the typical cartel hideouts seen in past investigations. These were organized facilities with reinforced doors, surveillance equipment, separate holding rooms, and ventilation systems. Doors that agents breached during raids revealed rows of migrants packed shoulder to shoulder, some terrified, some confused, many unaware of which country they were even in. They were being stored like inventory. Further evidence shifted the situation from troubling to urgent. Over the previous 18 months, La Empresa-linked cases showed a disturbing consistency. 27 executions executed with tight grouping shot surveillance systems disabled seconds before attacks, and routes chosen to allow rapid extraction. According to DW and Guardian military correspondents, the tactics aligned with those used by trained paramilitary cells: minimal noise, precision movement, minimal exposure. This was more than crime. This was infiltration. Strategic analysis from Defense News and Janes reinforced the severity. Unlike traditional cartels that rely on show-of-force intimidation, La Empresa aimed to blend in, not dominate. Its operators dressed normally, drove unremarkable vehicles, and avoided drawing attention. Their goal was stable occupation, not public chaos. That approach is far more difficult for law enforcement to detect and far more dangerous in the long term. A cartel operating quietly inside the United States undermines not only security, but the strategic prestige of the nation itself, testing whether America can safeguard its own territory from foreign criminal actors. The human impact was equally stark. Families living just a few blocks from Sunland Park's stash houses had no idea that dozens of migrants were held captive behind blacked-out windows. Businesses unknowingly operated near weapon storage sites. Migrants themselves became invisible casualties, some believing they were still in Mexico, others under the impression they were moments from legal release. In truth, they were pawns in a larger hidden operation threading through the Southwest. This expansion forced an unavoidable question. If La Empresa has already built roots this deep inside the country, how far might its influence spread before communities recognize the threat growing behind their own front doors? What does it mean when federal agents prepare not for arrests, but for combat inside US neighborhoods? That was the atmosphere at dawn as joint task forces mobilized across New Mexico and Texas. The execution in El Paso, the discovery of organized stash houses, and the whispers surrounding La Empresa had shifted the United States into a new phase of confrontation. According to internal briefings later described by Reuters and The Guardian, the Trump administration ordered immediate interagency coordination, instructing FBI, ICE, DHS, and state police to treat the unfolding threat as an organized infiltration rather than isolated cartel activity. The event that set the crackdown into motion occurred in Las Cruces. Surveillance teams had been monitoring a gray SUV tied to multiple smuggling operations. When the vehicle pulled into a quiet residential street, agents closed in. 3 armed men stepped out with long rifles, unmasked, unhurried, moving with the confidence of individuals who believed they controlled the terrain. When unmarked law enforcement vehicles boxed them in, the suspects did not hesitate. They ran, and moments later the neighborhood erupted. What followed was a chase through streets where children rode bicycles only hours earlier. Tires screamed across pavement, sirens split the air. Residents pressed their faces to windows as tactical teams cornered the suspects. The SUV smashed through a backyard fence, skidding to a halt. Gunfire broke out as the suspects forced their way into a small stucco home. Agents returned fire, clearing hallways in seconds. When the scene stabilized, officers found a weapons depot inside rifles stacked along walls, ammunition boxes, tactical vests, encrypted radios, and 3 migrants huddled in a back bedroom awaiting ransom calls that would never come. Key developments unfolded rapidly. Within hours, coordinated raids hit stash houses across Sunland Park, El Paso's outskirts, and rural pockets of Texas. Some suspects surrendered immediately. Others opened fire the moment their doors were breached. In one raid near Anthony, Texas, agents encountered gunfire from a narrow hallway. Another team storming an abandoned trailer outside Deming discovered tripwires and pressure plates, evidence of militarized defensive tactics. DW analysts noted how quickly La Empresa adapted embedding traps more commonly seen in conflict zones than in American deserts. Strategic analysis from Defense News highlighted the troubling implications. La Empresa had not been surprised. It had been delayed. The group's preparations indicated an expectation of confrontation. As federal pressure intensified, cartel operatives responded with escalating violence, targeting officers with ferocity not seen on U.S. soil since earlier cartel incursions more than a decade ago. This shift reflected a dangerous balance of power, a foreign criminal organization testing whether America's enforcement apparatus could withstand sustained coordinated pushback. And the pushback came swiftly. In Laredo, a pickup truck loaded with migrants and gunmen rammed a federal patrol car, flipping both vehicles and killing 6 people. Hours later in Arizona, a convoy of state troopers faced a military-style ambush by a black SUV that vanished into desert darkness. In California's Central Valley, a veteran officer was assassinated in his personal vehicle with short, controlled bursts, the unmistakable signature of trained shooters. The human impact reverberated across the Southwest. Officers were warned not to travel alone, even off duty. Some departments requested military-grade equipment. Rural agencies began escorting personnel home after their shifts. Communities that once felt distant from border violence now watched it unfold in their own backyards. And so the question deepened: if La Empresa is willing to confront the US government with open violence, how long before this shadow conflict reshapes the definition of domestic security itself? What happens when a migration route, once a symbol of hope, becomes a battlefield controlled by armed scouts, hidden stash sites, and a cartel that treats human beings as currency? As federal raids intensified across New Mexico and Texas, another crisis spread quietly across the borderlands. It did not produce flashing lights or dramatic arrests. It produced whispers, disappearances, and trails of belonging scattered across desert floors. The human corridor, stretching from El Paso to Tucson and onward to California's Central Valley, had transformed into something far darker, a hunting ground for La Empresa. The event that brought this reality into focus came from the same Sunland Park stash house uncovered during the early raids. Inside cramped rooms, agents found migrants packed shoulder to shoulder, some exhausted, others dehydrated, many unsure whether they were in Mexico or the United States. Reuters later reported that several had been moved through multiple states while blindfolded. Some believed they were hours from legal release. Instead, they were waiting for cartel phone calls, demanding thousands of dollars from families who had no idea their relatives were being held as leverage. For La Empresa, people were not passengers, they were inventory. Key developments emerged as investigations expanded westward. Ranchers in southern Arizona began finding makeshift desert camps littered with abandoned backpacks, torn shirts, and foreign identification cards. Not all camps were empty. Some held signs of struggle, dragged footprints, spilled water jugs, and personal items left behind in haste. Border agents reported that cartel scouts, often armed with rifles and night vision gear, were monitoring the terrain like military sentries. Migrants who tried bypassing known routes were intercepted anyway. Some were beaten, some were taken, some simply vanished into the night. One case described by The Guardian involved a young woman found alone in a dry Arizona wash. She told investigators that armed men had intercepted her group, selecting several migrants and forcing them into a truck before driving away. She never saw those people again. DW analysts noted that La Empresa had begun using migrants for multiple purposes, transporting narcotics, delivering packages, or serving as leverage in ransom schemes. In some instances, migrants were photographed with weapons and threatened with violence unless families paid. Others were coerced into assisting with logistics. A few were offered a brutal ultimatum: work for the cartel or disappear. Strategic analysis revealed why the situation worsened. As federal pressure mounted from multi-state raids, La Empresa tightened its grip on migrant pathways. External stress on a cartel rarely weakens its hold. It shifts brutality downward toward the most vulnerable. The Trump administration's intelligence briefings, referenced by BBC and Reuters, warned that cartel infiltration now overlapped with humanitarian crises. A criminal organization expanding inside the United States was also weaponizing the desperation of migrants, turning people into shields against enforcement. The human impact grew heavier with each discovery. Search teams found abandoned baby blankets, small shoes, and water bottles left near canyon routes. Medical examiners across Arizona and California reported rises in unidentified remains, suggesting migrants were being pushed into more remote terrain to avoid cartel-operated corridors. Churches and shelters along traditional pathways saw frightened migrants arrive with the same warning: do not go that way. Men with guns are waiting. The crisis extended beyond border towns. In Central California's vast agricultural regions, migrants who escaped cartel control described stash houses embedded in quiet neighborhoods, some hidden behind normal family homes with trimmed lawns and parked minivans. Bakersfield police investigating one such location discovered migrants held in locked bedrooms, while cartel operatives circulated outside in rented vehicles that blended effortlessly into the suburban landscape. This raised a deeper question, one with national consequences. If migrant routes have become cartel-controlled networks stretching across 4 states, how long before the humanitarian crisis transforms into a full-scale security emergency affecting millions of Americans far beyond the border? What does a nation do when a cartel evolves from a border threat into a multi-state network capable of coordinating attacks, moving people like assets, and embedding itself inside American suburbs? That was the question confronting Washington as intelligence briefings flowed into the Situation Room. The violence in El Paso, the armed encounters across New Mexico and Texas, the disappearing migrants in Arizona, the assassinations in California, none of it looked isolated anymore. According to early reporting from Reuters and BBC, senior officials concluded that La Empresa was no longer a foreign criminal group pressing against the border. It had become a structural threat operating inside the United States. The event that triggered the policy shift came during a late-night strategic review involving DHS, FBI, ICE, ATF, and military liaison officers. Drone footage from Arizona showed cartel scouts using advanced optics. Satellite images revealed stash sites linked by coordinated vehicle movements. Intercepted calls connected ransom operations from New Mexico to California. The evidence formed a picture too coherent to ignore. La Empresa was positioning itself to carve out operational territory within the U.S. homeland, and under the Trump administration's doctrine emphasizing preemption against narco-terror networks, the mandate was clear: federal agencies would no longer respond piecemeal. They would strike back in unison. Key developments came swiftly. A nationwide directive ordered the consolidation of intelligence streams under a single multi-agency command. Field offices received emergency funding for surveillance aircraft mobile command units and specialized tactical teams. Air assets were reassigned from coastal operations to high-risk land corridors. Defense News reported that elements of military intelligence began assisting with pattern-of-life analysis, a rare measure typically reserved for international counterterrorism missions, not domestic anti-cartel operations. 3 strategic priorities shaped the crackdown. First, dismantle the smuggling architecture. Drones and fixed-wing aircraft tracked suspicious convoys moving across state lines. License plate scans, cell phone pings, and traffic camera analytics mapped routes in real time. Vehicles suspected of transporting migrants or weapons were intercepted on secondary roads, not main highways, to avoid public panic. Second, cripple the financial backbone. Treasury investigators followed cash drops, crypto transfers, and shell company payments. Al Jazeera later reported that several legitimate small businesses, auto shops, laundromats, delivery services had quietly funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into accounts linked to stash houses. Third, protect law enforcement. After multiple ambushes, agencies issued reinforced armor, mandated 2-unit patrols, and altered officer travel routes daily to prevent predictable patterns. Some rural departments began receiving National Guard advisory support, an echo of strategies previously used during cartel escalation periods along the Mexican border. Strategic analysis across DW and The Guardian emphasized a critical truth: La Empresa's goal was not chaos. It was occupation, silent, methodical, incremental. A cartel that avoids detection gains power not by overwhelming cities, but by blending into them. And that posed a challenge far greater than traditional drug trafficking. It tested the country's ability to maintain security without eroding civil liberties, to confront hidden violence without reshaping everyday American life, to preserve national prestige without sliding into permanent militarization of the Southwest. But the human impact of the federal response was immediate. More checkpoints appeared along desert roads. Helicopters circled above rural communities long after midnight. Families living near stash house raids described armored vehicles rolling past front porches as agents executed warrants. Migrant shelters faced overwhelming demand as rescued individuals, some traumatized, some injured, many terrified, arrived with stories of extortion and disappearance. Small towns that once felt distant from border conflict suddenly found themselves on the fault line of a widening struggle. Through all this, one question began to dominate public conversation. Was this a temporary crackdown, or was the United States witnessing the emergence of a persistent new battleground inside its own territory? What if the most dangerous threats to a nation do not storm its borders but quietly root themselves inside its neighborhoods disguised as ordinary homes, ordinary vehicles, ordinary movements? That was the fear growing across the United States as investigators pieced together the full scale of La Empresa's infiltration. By the time federal agencies aligned their forces, the cartel had already demonstrated something extraordinary: the ability to operate inside the country with discipline, patience, and deadly efficiency. The event that crystallized this realization was not a raid or a firefight, but a map, a sprawling intelligence overlay compiled from satellite images, drone feeds, financial transactions, and phone intercepts. According to reporting from Reuters and The Guardian, the map connected stash houses in Sunland Park to vehicle depots in Las Cruces, communication nodes in West Texas, and ransom call centers reaching into California's Central Valley. It revealed a latticework of operations built with strategic intent. La Empresa had not simply crossed the border, it had embedded itself. Key developments showed how far this embedding had progressed. In urban areas, agents discovered stash sites disguised behind respectable suburban facades, complete with manicured lawns and quiet streets. In rural regions, investigators found kidnapped migrants forced into labor transporting equipment, handling packages, or operating under threat of violence. In California, ambush tactics used against officers echoed patterns once documented along cartel corridors in northern Mexico, yet now they were unfolding in residential American communities. Defense News and Jane's analysts noted that La Empresa's logistical discipline matched that of small insurgent groups, signaling an evolution from traditional organized crime into something far more structured and dangerous. Strategic analysis underscored a grim reality: the United States was facing a hybrid threat, part criminal syndicate, part paramilitary organism. It challenged not only domestic law enforcement but also America's global posture. Allies watching the escalation questioned how a foreign criminal entity could penetrate the world's most sophisticated homeland security apparatus. The balance between security and freedom tightened. How does a country protect its communities without militarizing them? How does it confront a network embedded among civilians without eroding the civil liberties that define American life? These were questions quietly debated inside Washington, where officials recognized that every decision would shape America's image as a nation capable of defending itself against non-state actors. Yet the human impact revealed the deepest urgency. Migrants trapped in stash houses, officers ambushed on highways, families caught in crossfire zones. These were not abstract data points. They were individuals living at the edge of a conflict they never anticipated. Communities along the Southwest Corridor reported surges in fear as night helicopters circled overhead. Parents altered driving routes. Rural counties requested protective gear previously reserved for crisis zones. Migrant shelters overflowed with traumatized people, describing disappearances, forced labor, and terror. The shadow of La Empresa stretched far beyond law enforcement briefings. It touched lives, shaped routines, and redefined the sense of safety for millions. Across the Southwest, residents asked the question that now haunts the national conversation: if a cartel can infiltrate this, deeply operate this quietly, and strike this precisely, what other threats might already be taking root in the spaces America overlooks? And as this hidden conflict unfolds, one truth remains: vigilance is no longer optional. Awareness is no longer a luxury. For those watching, those living in these borderlands, and those just now learning the scale of this threat, will the country confront it fully, or will silence allow it to spread further? If this investigation matters, stay informed, stay aware, and help push this story into the light. A covert execution in El Paso shatters the illusion that cartel violence remains outside U.S. borders, revealing a disciplined and deeply embedded network known as La Empresa. Investigations expose stash houses, migrant holding sites, and paramilitary-style cells stretching from New Mexico through Texas, Arizona, and into California. What begins as a targeted killing quickly unfolds into a multi-state crisis: armed ambushes, militarized traps, disappearing migrants, and coordinated attacks against law enforcement. According to reporting referenced across Reuters, BBC, DW, Defense News, Jane's, Al Jazeera, and The Guardian, La Empresa operates less like a traditional cartel and more like an insurgent force seeking silent occupation rather than chaotic domination. In response, the Trump administration orders the largest anti-cartel crackdown in over a decade, merging intelligence streams and deploying advanced surveillance assets across critical corridors. But even as federal pressure increases, the humanitarian toll grows. Migrants exploited, officers, targeted communities shaken. The confrontation exposes a deeper national dilemma: how to defend American territory without eroding civil liberties, and how to preserve strategic prestige while combating a hidden evolving threat. As the conflict continues to unfold, one question remains unavoidable. Will the nation confront this infiltration decisively, or will the shadows deepen further?